Welcome to the 5th season of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I'm happy to go on this journey with you. Today, we will be discussing a historic earthquake in Syria. After just a few days of a lightning military push by rebels, Bashar al-Assad's regime has fallen, and Assad has fled to Syria. It marked the end of a 54-year dynasty for him and his father Hafez. Their rule was that of a minority group of Alawites, only 12% of the Syrian population, that dominated Syria with an iron fist. Assad's rule was marked by incredible brutality. Many listeners may remember his suppression of a 2011 uprising using chemical weapons against his own people, backed by Iran. However, the recent fall of the Assad regime is by no means a fairy tale ending. The rebels who toppled Assad are designated by the United States as an FTO, or foreign terrorist organization, and we know from history that a power vacuum left in the Mideast is a recipe for disaster. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Organization for the Freedom of the Levant, is a group that brought Assad down. It was based in northern Syria. They are a Sunni Islamist insurgent group that has evolved from being an al-Qaeda branch in Syria. While HTS, as it is known, is currently seen as the dominant group, the balance of power in Syria is incredibly fragile. The opportunity for competing factions to challenge HTS is ripe, and the security situation is volatile. And while the U.S. currently has around 900 troops supporting Kurdish forces in this area in an attempt to keep ISIS at bay, it should be pointed out that President-elect Trump has been outspoken in his desire to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. This all comes at a critical moment. Syria's key backers, Russia and Iran, have been distracted by other consequential matters, specifically the war in Ukraine and the erosion of Iran's proxy network against Israel. Syria has played a unique role in Iran's axis against Israel, as weapons and other illicit materials have made their way to the West Bank and Jordan through Syria, and most importantly, to Lebanon and Hezbollah. Thus, we are at a critical juncture. How much influence will Russia, Turkey, and Iran have in shaping Syria's future? Who will ultimately fill the power vacuum? And what role will the U.S. and Israel play in this tense environment? To help us answer these questions, I'm joined by two experts, Andrew Tabler and Tamir Hyman. Andrew Tabler is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a colleague of mine. He previously served as a senior director to the Special Envoy for Syrian Engagement at the Department of State's Bureau of Near East Affairs, and was also the director at the White House's National Security Council. Andrew Tabler, welcome to Decision Points.
Pleasure to be with you, David.
So I just want us to first understand the magnitude of the moment for the Middle East, for Syria itself, when we're talking about the Assad family that has really had a grip over this country of Syria for the last 54 years. What does it mean that this family and this regime has fallen after so long?
It's something we're actually trying to figure out right now, right? How do I feel about it as someone who's worked on Syria for 25 years? It's like a star imploding. The Assad family, which came to power in 1970 and has been in power until just a few days ago, in terms of a dynasty, they helped stabilize what was then one of the world's most unstable countries. Syria, even during the Mandate period and then after the Second World War, was extremely unstable. The Assads brought stability to Syria, but it was a horribly brutal one. And also, of course, caused a lot of havoc with the United States and its allies, in that it was the satellite of first the Soviet Union, and then after 1979, one of the, if not the, largest allies of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the Middle East. That structure has collapsed very rapidly in favor of this new advance by HTS, which is a sort of Salafist jihadist organization. And so this organization is now in control of the reins of power in Damascus. And now anything is possible. Many people that have been outside the country are already there. Many of my friends, I lived in Syria for about 7 years. Many people have gone back. We have many ambassadors who have gone back, Ambassador Robert Ford, for example. In many ways, it's like 1989. And I was in Germany right before the wall fell. So, there were always signs of these things, but you never dreamt that it would happen like this. But the concerns about a new Syria are very different than 1989, right? Where, that was a different period of time, a different structure, a different continent. That's what everybody's focused their attention on now as the dust settles in Damascus.
So before we get to the new regime, just understand the old regime. So for our listeners, the whole idea of like the Alawites, which are right an offshoot of the Shia, is it right? They're only about 12% of Syria. How did a minority group like the Alawites under the Assads, Hafiz al-Assad, and now Bashar al-Assad, how did this group really able to rule as a minority over, a country that's a majority Sunni country? People would say only an iron fist could have made this possible.
The climb of the Assads to power is an interesting one. Hafiz al-Assad, who was an Air Force pilot and then later general.
Minister of Defense.
Minister of Defense. Hafiz al-Assad was a very, very intelligent person. He, like many Alawites, was inducted into the Syrian military actually by the French during the Mandate period and then immediately after. Because of this, Alawites were able to climb the ladder because the majority Sunnis didn't participate in military affairs that much, didn't want to. Therefore, the Alawites, in terms of officers, grew. And then in the 1960s, after the union with Egypt broke up, there was a lot of turbulence in the Syrian arena, and there were different figures who were contesting for power. Interestingly, during Black September in 1970, you remember the great episode when the supposed Palestinian tanks came out of Damascus, right, and were going down towards Amman to take over the capital
of Jordan.
Exactly. Heading down there, and Henry Kissinger calls Israel, and they send a quartet of jets to fly over that column. And they turn around and go back, and then, of course, save the Hashemite monarchy. Hafiz al-Assad, who is the commander of the Air Force, Minister of Defense, he didn't order a counterstrike with the Syrian Air Force to engage the Israelis. And so therefore, interestingly, after that, this sign of weakness vis-a-vis Israel, he was able to parlay into a sort of soft coup d'etat, where in November of 1970, he takes power in a bloodless coup. That ushers in this minority-dominated clientelistic regime, and they're typically the hardest to break. Usually they only break from an external military force, like Saddam Hussein's was the same structure, but the Assad regime was different in that Sunnis represented about a quarter of the Iraqi population, whereas Alawites are only 12%. So they had to rely on other sects within that grouping. And that made it more fragile in the end. But also, there were a lot of tremendous regional developments in 2024, which weakened their allies, and they ran out of steam.
How Assad held on all these years, right? He made sure that he was basically a client of the Soviet Union, Soviet weaponry. He always had it seem like a stronger partner with him. The Egyptians fought in the 73 war. He attacked in the north, but the Egyptians were in the south. He had Soviet weaponry. Because he wasn't a Sunni during the Iran-Iraq war, right, in the 80s, he aligned himself with the Iranians. He always had somebody on his side that he wasn't alone. But when the Cold War ends and the Soviet Union, who's his weapon supplier, crumbles, then he goes to Madrid to a peace conference. But he always wants to position himself, and I think because, you're the expert, as a minority-dominated regime, he wanted to be the beating heart of Arabism, that he was a rejectionist, he was not Anwar Sadat of Egypt. He didn't have that kind of self-confidence. He positioned himself that no one could outmaneuver him to his right. And in the end, whatever the peace efforts in the 90s, they fell short. But it seemed like it was his iron fist that enabled this minority regime to hold on for all these years. Is that fair?
Yes. So what you're pointing out there, Hafiz was incredibly intelligent. He was a very brutal man, but he's very intelligent. The beating heart of Arabism wasn't just because of Syrian culture. It was sort of an Arab nationalist type approach. But I think they very, very much believed that their legitimacy came through standing up to Israel in, of course, the 1973 war after the loss in 1967. And then I think he uses that external threat to justify his grip on power, whereas previously his grip on power, the emergency law in Syria, was based on internal instability immediately after the Ba'ath seizure of power in March 1963. So it flips from domestic instability as the reason for the emergency law into repelling and fighting Israel. And I think this gave him a lot of cards to play domestically. He stabilized the country. And then, of course, as you mentioned, goes to Madrid when the Cold War ends. Then Bashar takes over. I think what you're getting at there is maybe the second part of your question is sort of where does it all go wrong? Why,
Yes.
why does it change?
He had outsized influence, the father. Hafiz al-Assad is a very wily, savvy, albeit brutal figure who could like punch above his weight in a certain way. He dies, he hands it over to his son. This wasn't the son who he thought would succeed him, but that son was killed in a car crash. So Bashar, the ophthalmologist who studied in London, he takes over, and then what goes wrong?
I think there are a few things. I mentioned this in a piece in the New York Times briefly, but I'll give you the fuller version of it in the last week. I spent about 7 years in Syria and knew the Assads, had interactions with Bashar and his wife Asma, and had a chance to co-found the Countries for His English Language magazine, Syria Today. So I had a lot of time to sort of think about this. I think there are a few standouts. One is he's an extremely awkward person in his presence, the way he spoke. I just think there was something going on under the surface. Those that interacted with him were perplexed because Hafiz al-Assad, as Ed Derigian, a former ambassador to Syria, would say, he would very seldomly agree on anything. But when he did, you could build something around it. And this became very important for diplomacy in the United States. Bashar was completely different. You go into a meeting with him. He would promise the world, say yes, 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 or promise part of it, whether I or other diplomats would walk out of the meeting thinking that you had a deal. And then a couple of days later, he would turn around and do not just something that slightly violated it, but completely the opposite. In my piece, I cited the peace talks, most recent ones, which were headed by Fred Hoff.
I remember that. I read your piece.
Yeah. And, at the same time, U.S. satellite photography finds that the Syrians are either transferring or training Hezbollah on Scud missiles. Well, how do you pursue peace with Israel at the same time you're about ready to transfer and train the enemies of Israel on strategic weapons that are capable of carrying chemical weapons payloads? It just completely eroded his credibility. I think that was a major, major change. I think that was probably because of his psychology. In my opinion, some people said that he was schizophrenic. There are others who think it was more like borderline personality disorder. I tend to think the latter. But whatever it was, it really bedeviled him. And it made it so that even those that were in the regime, and I knew many of them who were around the regime, even they didn't know what was going on. And I think this ultimately caused the regime to become difficult to follow. And then I think also there was the other biggest factor, and that was just demographics. So you mentioned before about the history of Syria after the Muslim Brotherhood uprising between 1979 and 1982, that culminated in the Hama massacre of February of 1982, famous massacre where the Syrian Assad forces special companies surround the city of Hama. They open up with artillery and mortar fire and kill between 10 and 30,000 Syrians. During that time, they end up locking down and arresting all of their opponents, even those that weren't in the Muslim Brotherhood, and they just disappeared or were killed. The country was placed on lockdown for about 10 years. Not to put too fine of a point on it, but what happens when men and women don't have anything to do for 10 years and they're all locked up inside and you can't trade? There's a huge spike in birth rates in Syria. So Syria was among the 20 fastest growing populations in the world between 1982 and 1992. Therefore, when Bashar took over, these young people were increasingly approaching the job market. You had a centrally planned Soviet satellite-esque state that no longer was producing oil like it used to, and therefore was running out of cash. It needed to have funding. Therefore, they tried to launch a reform process, and which I covered in depth, and we've talked about many times, David. And this was after Bashar took power. But that reform process was just a house of cards. Most of the time, legislation either wasn't there or contradicted itself, and the system just became very corrupt because bribes became the legislation or the legal underpinning of everything. And that made the system further inefficient, didn't allow it to absorb young people. Those young people then were ready for action when the uprising broke out in 2011. And therefore, that led to the protests, and it also led to ultimately those young people, many of them joining the armed factions, which have been fighting against Bashar al-Assad, or had until last week, for almost 14 years.
I mean, you say there was a lockdown, meaning they couldn't travel outside of Syria. Is that it?
Not everybody could. There were
Really?
not a lot of imports. Syrians talk about not having toilet paper, but the hard currency reserves of Syria were supposedly taken by Rifat al-Assad to leave the country. Of course, that's up to historians. I've never been able to prove it. Maybe we can prove it now. But in any case, they didn't have enough money. This lockdown meant also that from a security standpoint, people just had to stay at home. During that time, people had nothing else to do than reproduce. And this is not uncommon. Wars kill people, lead to a decline in birth rates. But in some cases, war leads to an increase in birth rates in certain areas because people have to stay indoors. And let's just say get onto more basic matters.
Let me understand, like the hollowing out of the military. To what extent is that a function of the regime's decline? I mean, there was a time under Hafez al-Assad, I think he met Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah once. He saw him as an instrument of Syrian power, and yet Hezbollah became stronger than the regime itself. I want to understand the hollowing out effect. Is that a function of Iran's ability to create a state within a state? But Hezbollah's in Lebanon, it's not in Syria. But even though they were using Syria as a land bridge and the like, I'm just trying to understand how the army crumbled so quickly. What does it tell you about the military? And also, when you just say about Iran and Russia, it seemed like they gave up on Assad. They stopped bombing raids for them or anything like that, the Russians. Was it because they were distracted with conflicts in the Ukraine for Russia and a conflict in Lebanon with Hezbollah these last few months for Iran? And I'm just trying to understand the crumbling from within of the military and the fact that his allies, Russia and Iran, that had stood with him, suddenly just gave up on him. So it appears.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. So the uprising was a major challenge for the regime. In other majoritarian systems, what these protests did was it put soldiers and their leaders and their officers in dilemmas. You either shoot the protesters who are demanding freedom, or you end up getting rid of the person that gave you the order to shoot them. In majoritarian system, it's a little different because the troops and the officers who are out in the streets are from the same sect or from the same majority grouping as the protesters. And so therefore they have love, admiration, and compassion for them. The Alawi officers and minority officers, it was a little different. They didn't regard them as the same. Even if you had Sunni enlisted men ordering them to fire, many of those who did fire either missed or ran away or defected. So over time, what happened is the Syrian military was weakened because of a lack of manpower, because still the majority were Sunni in the country. They weren't joining the ranks. Therefore, Alawites had to fight increasingly as regular soldiers instead of officers, and other minorities also had to join them. And so over time, they just had a smaller pool of people, 12%, maybe even 10. So over time, their loss rate went up and up and up, and the numbers went down and down and down. So what happens when you face that? Well, you can start using strategic weapons, which they did in the form of chemical weapons. We know about that. And they used that throughout the war until even very recently, and that's a big problem. But also what they did is they needed shock troops, and they ordered Hezbollah in 2012 to support the regime. Our late fellow Jeff White wrote a great piece about this called The Qusair Rules, and it talked about the Hezbollah's intervention there, and it talked about how it was able to use as a strike force Hezbollah regulars to push back the rebels. Iran and Hezbollah came to the rescue for Assad and saved him for a while. But because he never changed, because of the demographics in the country, because Sunnis had run away from the military, they were continuing to lose ground in Syria. That continued until after the JCPOA agreement was signed in 2015. As we know, Qasem Soleimani flew to Moscow.
That's the Iran nuclear deal for our listeners.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry about this. I don't want to give too many acronyms. The Iran nuclear deal. Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, flies to Moscow.
Of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards.
Correct.
And he's like a right hand of Khamenei, the supreme leader, Ayatollah of Iran.
Correct. And so therefore, suddenly we start noticing that someone is lengthening the Syrian runways on the Syrian coast for jets to come in. And the Russians come in with their armed forces, and particularly their Air Force. And an Air Force bombing indiscriminately can do a lot of good for even a ragtag army backed up by shock troops. And this mosaic strategy, as the Russians call it, of Russian air power, Hezbollah shock troops, and Syrian regulars pushed the rebels back and retook Aleppo in the summer of 2016, right before President Trump's election. That held. The rebels continued to lose ground until basically the lines were frozen with the outbreak of the pandemic. in 2020. So the rebels in the Northwest stopped losing territory. And then another change that would ultimately come to affect the regime, I think, substantially, was the introduction of sanctions, U.S. sanctions on Syria, called the Caesar sanctions for mass atrocities. And these were airdropped into legislation or brought into U.S. legislation in December of 2020.
You were working in the administration on the Syria file when you came up with the sanctions idea.
Well, first of all, there are many people that worked on the sanctions. I was more on the what can we do with this end of things rather than the technical or legal aspect of them. But mass atrocities are something that are just abhorrent. Syria didn't officially suffer a genocide, but it's pretty damn close, right? I mean, the atrocities we see coming out of Syria are on par with that of the Third Reich. Those photographs show bodies with tags to the ears and the nose with numbers on them, like the
Oh my
Nazis
God.
did, with complete
Wow.
files that they're now finding in Damascus. It's awful.
Wow.
Those sanctions went into place. They had what are called secondary effects. That meant that even though Assad had cobbled together this force, this mosaic force, and wanted to rebuild the country, U.S. sanctions targeted any party that was trying to get involved in reconstruction in Syria. It wasn't just U.S. entities. So in the case of countries that wanted to help Assad rebuild, they could not get more fully involved because their entity that would get involved would run risk of falling foul of U.S. sanctions. Of course, you're never going to give up your trade and relationship with the United States to go and bail out a tin-pot dictator like Bashar al-Assad. But over time, it got in the way and it kept reconstruction from happening, apart from some early recovery activities. That substantially weakened the regime economically. At the same time, also had, I think, a very strong effect on the Syrian economy, led to the crash of the Syrian pound. And now it's going to be very difficult. I think we're going to need to do some hard thinking about what do we do with sanctions going forward and how do we make sure that Syrians who took over the country reap a benefit without funding, of course, terrorist groups. So I don't want to get ahead of myself.
I mean, if you were to now understand the new guys, we don't understand exactly why does Turkey, for example, seem to be fueling the rebels and whether the rebels have truly broken from ISIS, Nusra, and Al-Qaeda. They claim they're not part of the old ISIS or Al-Qaeda, that they are a more open Syria, but their track record leaves a lot of people nervous. And the United States give them what we call in government the FTO, a foreign terrorist organization designation, suggesting that that's the view of the United States government about these people. I guess the question is, are they capable of growing and being inclusive of non-Islamist efforts to be more moderate that would make you think that their words could match their rhetoric? So I guess it's the role of Turkey and the evolution of what they call HTS. Should it give people hope or fear?
First of all, the role of Turkey is huge. There's rumor that President Erdogan will be praying in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus tomorrow. That's a big change. As for HTS, so HTS and Abu Muhammad al-Jilani started out fighting against U.S. forces and later went on with al-Qaeda, broke away from these organizations in I believe it was 2017, but anyways, a number of years ago. And since that time has had their own organization, which is an amalgam of a number of Salafist jihadist groups. In breaking with the organization, they have instituted a campaign of moderation to be more inclusive and to improve governance, and a number of other issues. And while those things are good, the question is, how much can a Salafist jihadist group, really change? And I think that is a great question that now two groups of people are going to have to work this out. One are the lawyers in the U.S. government. It's always fun to get those folks in the room. And then another one is just a political decision. And I think the Biden administration right now on its way out is trying to determine that. To what degree can you delist HTS as a foreign terrorist organization? I think it's going to be hard. I don't think these groups change that much. And certainly what we need to do is look very clearly, what do we want them to do to change? What do we need to see from them that's more inclusive? What are the bottom lines that the international community needs in order to provide reconstruction funding? These are things we all thought about concerning Assad. Now we have to think about them concerning HTS. And so there's a lot of thinking right now in the government going into this. I was on a number of calls yesterday about this, and it's going to be a hot topic going forward. What we do know is that HTS is generally considered the current government until at least March 1st for an initial transition period. We will see what they're able to roll out during that time.
What would be for our listeners telltale signs for you as an expert that you'll be listening for? What should people be watching to see? Is this a regime that is not a jihadi regime, but is going to evolve in a favorable way? What are some of the telltale signs for you?
Some of it comes down to legal basis, right? Like what kind of law is used inside of Syria? Is it Islamic law? Is it a combination of Syrian law and Islamic law? How do they treat minorities, for example? I think politically it becomes harder because you have to think about, is it just about being inclusive? Well, you can always find some folks to go along with you who aren't from your sect, probably, right? But to what degree do those people actually have power? Or is it that HTS has all the power? It's a Potemkin kind of model. We don't know that. And then, of course, there is the aspect of foreign policy. A Salafist jihadist or an Islamist government, let's put it that way, in Damascus, how is it going to regard Israel or Jordan or other countries and their internal affairs as concerns Muslims, as concerns minorities, as concerns security, as concerns smuggling, as concerns a lot of things? We don't know that yet. We're going to know a lot more soon. First, we're going to know a little bit more about the internal jockeying, and then after that, we're going to know about their external posture. Israel is in the midst of fighting the Hamas war. If you have an organization, Islamist organization that is beside Israel, to what degree do you worry that they're going to pull off an attack like we saw on October 7th? I think that's going to be of real concern. And I think that's probably why you saw Israel destroying so many Syrian weapons over the last week, trying to get some things done before the dust settles in Damascus and people focus on what's next.
Can the international system influence this regime in terms of its shape, its composition? I would think they need reconstruction. They don't want to be listed as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States. They clearly would like the Turks to keep supporting them. Do you think external actors here can come together and somehow have an influence on the contours of this new Syria?
I do. I think there are a couple of things. First of all, I think it's important not to rush to delist HTS. Right now, HTS wants to be taken off the list in exchange for working with the international community on transition. We should just slow down because we need to watch their next steps here. It's important not to put the cart out in front of the horse. And Secretary Blinken's released a couple of statements this week through dealing with that. There's also the personal designation on Abu Muhammad al-Julani. How will that be used? Those are huge parts of leverage over HTS about what has to happen in terms of the interim government or a new government or a process. The only agreed upon process internationally for a Syrian transition is called United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254, which basically means a national ceasefire, a temporary sort of transitional government that leads to elections between, quote, the current government, the opposition, and other groups, end quote. That formula, presumably through an election, that would elect and appoint a new government in Damascus to rule over Syrian territory. We have to watch, is that how HTS is going to do this? What are we going to do if they don't follow 2254? What are we going to do if they don't include other Syrian opposition groups or ones that we don't like? What are we going to do about that? Lots of questions, more questions than answers at this point.
Given your knowledge of Syria, do you think for sure they'll have a centralized government, or are the Druze in the south and the Kurds in the east and maybe the Alawites, in the west, in the Latakia coast on the Mediterranean, that it's not a guarantee that Syria is going to be centralized and that these different groups will be autonomous in some way?
Yeah, the near to medium term, Syria will be a divided country as it's been for the last decade or so. Ultimately, that depends on the process and what the central government's able to claw back. Syria has always been hard to rule. Even during the mandate period, the French had problems. They broke the country into parts at one point, where we had this governmental Latakia on the coast. They had the state of Damascus, the state of Aleppo, the Jebel Druze adjacent to Jordan. With a decentralized Syria, it would allow local communities who have fought during the war to liberate their territories, to solidify their gains, and to have destiny over the places that they live politically.
Would your advice be, and I understand the point about holding back on the delisting of the HTS, the nascent rebel government, till we know more, but would you urge the U.S. and the Europeans and maybe Israel in its own way and Turkey in its way to try to reach out and see if it could have a positive impact on the shape of this new government? Or do you say, look, the odds are it'll probably be a jihadi government. Be careful on outreach?
I think my general approach would be to do as little as possible until we know what their decisions are. This is one of those rare times when doing nothing is probably the best thing from our standpoint. We slow it down. HTS has tons of intermediaries. So even though it's a foreign terrorist organization, there are plenty of organizations that talk with them all the time. They have been for years. And some of these people, by the way, are great. They're really dedicated to their work, and I respect them very much. We're going to know pretty soon about what they have in mind. And then after that, we'll have to determine, is this an organization that's really changed its stripes or not? And there is precedent for this, right? So we partner with another foreign terrorist organization in northeast Syria, the PKK, to battle against ISIS. So there is precedent for this. But Jolani and the organization's ties to al-Qaeda, and also, of course, fighting against U.S. troops in Iraq directly, mean that Americans were in their crosshairs. Now, they might not be in their crosshairs now, but that's what some argue. But could they be in the future? And are they going to be a U.S. ally? I would doubt they're going to be a U.S. ally. They might just be a convenient adversary of the Iranians, who they definitely hate because the Iranians helped prop up the Assad regime for years and have been spilling Syrian blood and that of Sunnis. HTS is made up majority of Sunnis. So we're going to be in for a really, really interesting few months. I think we should watch developments between now and March 1st, and then we should then think very carefully about what we do next.
But you would say that we should stay with our friends, right? In other words, the United States, so active on SDF, I don't know, 900 American soldiers east of the Euphrates. Do we stick with our friends so we send a message that HTS, you got to be nice here? Does Israel, with its Druze community on the Golan and a Druze community, same families maybe even in southern Syria and Suwaida and places like that, by us sticking with our friends, do we help them in this period of transition?
Absolutely, we help them. And we have tons of contacts during the war. The United States, Israel, neighboring countries. And also, we used to have a lot of contacts with the armed groups. A lot of those things were cut off and the programs were turned off. But we should be turning them back on now. We should have a good neighbor policy with Syria because those people need help. And help provided at a key time can go a long way. Syrians are now in the midst of their revolution. They are not at the end of it yet. Now comes the hard part.
So you would recommend Israel to do what it did in the teens, which was during the Civil War, open up to the Druze and other Kurds and others who would need medical treatment in Israel, have a good neighbor policy the way it did. I mean, it stopped it once it looked like Assad had prevailed. But during the war, that was something that Israel seemed to win friends in southern Syria.
It's a great way people remember it. I lived in Syria for a long time. Many people in Syria regarded the United States as an enemy. But many Syrians I was able to help in my own small way, not to the degree to which Israel was in terms of life or death. But helping Syrians goes a long way. They remember it. They're in a turbulent society, in a difficult situation. We're trying to manage a very difficult emerging political environment. We need all the tools we can get. And so therefore, it's very little for us to help provide assistance to people who deserve it, while trying our best to keep it out of the hands of Islamists and others who are enemies of the United States. That's always tricky business. With humanitarian aid, it's a little easier because there aren't the legal requirements to make sure that it only gets into the right hands. It's for humanity in general. But you don't want to move too far beyond that unless you know who you're dealing with. Israel's been pretty good about that, I think. They had people they were working with inside the country. They're able to do a lot of good, and they bought some goodwill. And I think everybody will need that in the new Syria.
And it won't be held against them. I mean, that they're hitting the Syrian military. I mean, destroyed 80% of Assad's army, it looks like, has gone into a buffer zone. But I think for them, it's the trauma of October 7th. They're afraid that these jihadis on pickup trucks will keep going over the border. I don't think they mean any ill will against the people of Syria at all. It seems like, they feel like they want to take these defensive steps as they see it. But at the same time, I think if they could extend humanitarian assistance, they would want to do it.
I think it's really something small. I think it can do a lot of good. And I think people should focus on that right away. We don't know how this is going to turn out, but let's try and be humans and understand that Syrians have just overcome a national trauma that's really hard for most people to fathom. And also to understand that a lot of Syrians feel completely abandoned, and probably justifiably so, by the international community in the face of chemical weapons attacks and other things that they felt people should have come to their aid and they didn't.
It seems like this is a strategic defeat for Iran, coming on the heels of Israel decimating Hezbollah. Do you see it that this could not have happened, even if Israel was taken by surprise, as the world was, by the opposition and its rout of the regime in Syria? For Iran, can they recover from this in Syria? They might say, look, we help Hamas. They're Sunnis, we're Shia. Or do you think, no. People remember they were the biggest backer of this regime and Bashar al-Assad, and the land bridge of weapons to Hezbollah, that's history. I'm just trying to think, does Iran think it somehow could come back into Syria's good graces? Does it try to destabilize Jordan to hurt this new regime? What does Iran do as a result of this strategic defeat?
I think it's going to be hard for the Iranians to operate in the western part of Syria. They could, I suppose, in a turbulent or decentralized Syria, try and get some allies, but the people are pretty angry at them for their actions. They have a giant cluster of militia that are in the eastern part of Syria to the west of the Euphrates River. And so the question is, what happens to them? There are some reports that the IRGC is preparing to move out of Syria, or have given the order to move out of Syria. They're moving stuff out of Syria. It's a huge break for the Axis. Could they play their cards right, though, and get back in the game with an HTS-dominated government? Probably would be hard, or with another type of government. We don't know. But I think for the moment, I think the axis is cut through Syria. We just don't know for how long.
And Russia is another external power that had an Air Force base, a naval base. There have been reports that they are evacuating, some of their naval base. I don't know if these reports are accurate. Some say, look, if the U.S. and the Turks don't try to find a common relationship, the Russians will try on their own. How do you see the Russian dimension now as a result of things inside Syria?
I think it's going to be difficult for the Russians to hold on to their bases. And so I think they're preparing to leave. Whether they can strike a deal with Turkey, which would be the main arbiter of this or not, I don't know. But the Russians also, they made a decision not to back Assad in the end. I wrote about this in the Times article. I think that was partially because they're busy elsewhere in Ukraine, but also Assad just wasn't worth betting on. So they have two things to say. One is their operations at the Hamameen base, air base in the Syrian coast. The other one is a pier at Tartus. We think a lot has been pulled out of there. We'll have to wait and see if there's a full withdrawal. What does that mean? Do they leave and then come back? Is it permanent? We don't know, but I think it's going to be hard for them to hold on to it.
Is it fair to say this couldn't have happened without the Lebanon attack of Israel on Hezbollah? That the fact that it started, it seems like in earnest, just after the ceasefire was reached, that they thought, okay, Hezbollah has been decimated, they're distracted, Russia's distracted in the Ukraine. Some have called this an aftershock of October the 7th. Is there a clear correlation in your mind between Israel's decimation of the Hezbollah leadership and the timing of the rebels, even if they were not coordinated at all with Israel? No, I don't think maybe the Ayatollah is saying that this was all a plot of the U.S. and Israel, but that will come as a surprise to the Americans and the Israelis, who doesn't seem to have any clue that this was about to be set in motion. But in the eyes of the rebels, could this have happened without what happened in Lebanon?
What Israel's actions did in Lebanon over the last few months is that it killed the cavalry that was to come to the Syrian regime's rescue. It distracted them, and of course they were knocked off. So there was no one there. Even if the Russians wanted to intervene, who are they going to intervene on behalf of? And so therefore, it was all fall down. It was very brittle, and it went quick. I'll never forget it. It is something to see. The real hard work now is going to be in the next period, watching what comes out of there. And how do we manage it? That's probably going to be the immediate question. How do we manage this? How do we shape it? How do we deal with what ultimately ends up being the government in Damascus?
Well, Andrew, as this country's one of its premier Syria watchers, I will say this is not the end for you. It's just the end of the beginning. You've got a lot of work ahead as we see what takes shape in Syria at this historic moment, this historical earthquake, I would say. I just want to thank you very much. I know you're busy 24/7, but thank you very much for joining us today on Decision Points.
David, it's my pleasure, and be glad to join you anytime. And I wish you all the best to you and all of your listeners in 2025.
After hearing from Andrew about the implications of these historic times in Syria, I want to now turn to Tamir Hyman to give us a sense of the importance of developments in Syria for Israel. Tamir is the current director of the INSS, the leading national security think tank in Israel. He was the former head of IDF intelligence, where he focused a lot of time on Iranian entrenchment in Syria. Before that, he was very much involved in the effort to bring humanitarian assistance to southern Syria and to provide medical attention in Israel for Syrians in the south suffering during that country's civil war. Tamir, welcome to Decision Points.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
Tamir, please explain to us the magnitude of the moment for Syria, for the Middle East, and for Israel when the Assad family has fallen from power after 54 years of a grip on Syria. What does it mean in the big picture?
You can analyze that in the three circles that collapsed. Not collapsed totally, but are on a brink of collapse. First of all, the most evident one, for the first time since 74, Israel is practically destroying one of its former major enemies' army. Just tactical elimination of strategic and tactical capabilities of Syria, from the level of tanks to the level of vessels, through missiles, chemical laboratories, everything is being eliminated. So practically, Syrian army is not relevant anymore. In a more broader aspect of the regional aspect, the more Mediterranean, Middle Eastern aspect, it's a break in the Shiite crescent. If you consider the map, Syria is the connecting element of all access. Everything runs through Syria. Money, ammunition, command and control, everything runs through Syria and from Syria distributed either to Lebanon, to Hezbollah, or being passed away through Egypt, Sinai, to Hamas, Gaza Strip. When you remove that element, you are breaking the connections. And because of the fact that Hezbollah now is eroded dramatically, it means that we created an obstacle replenishing and rearming Hezbollah, which is a huge success and a major blow to the strategic vision of Soleimani. General Soleimani wanted to build a network of proxies that surrounds Israel in a circle of fire, ready to give the final blow. And that elimination is gone. In the more geopolitical level, it's a huge problem for Russia. Russia considered the Latakia harbor as exit to the Mediterranean, and it will insist on creating an airbase in Khmimim, which is southern to Turkey, in order to create a potential threat to NATO. That is, passing Turkey downwards, creating an exit point to the Mediterranean and creating a large airbase with missiles, S-400 surface-to-air missiles, 2 squadrons of MiG-22, and the vessels that they have built. That's a huge blow, and I imagine this will be the cornerstone of the future discussion between Putin and President-elect Trump over the future of Ukraine. That is all going to be connected into one discussion.
Let me understand, though, if this was so important to Russia, they have a naval base at Tartus on the Mediterranean coast where the Alawites live near the Latakia area. And if it was so critical to Iran as a land bridge where weapons are going from Iran through Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, if it was so strategically important to these two countries, why didn't they do the maximum to keep Assad in power? It seems that they both gave up on him. Was it because they were distracted with their own conflicts, either for Russia and Ukraine, or Lebanon because of the ceasefire and the decimation of Hezbollah? Was it they were distraction, or they thought that Assad was hopeless, that his army had rotted from within, and the regime was beyond help?
It's a great question, and I don't have the full answer, and it's very, very interesting. I think it's because of the fact that it was a total surprise for the Axis. The 8th of December is their 7th of October, if I may say that. In a matter of hours from attacking Aleppo, the Syrian army collapsed. It did not react. Even if the Syrian army would have stood for 24 hours of trying to contradict the offensive, I imagine they, that is the Iranians, militias, and Russia, would have the enough time to understand the grasp of the moment, to grasp the enormous point in history that they are facing, and they would have done something. The fact that Syrian army didn't really act at all, just collapsed, created a chain effect that led them to the conclusion that there's no one there to help. And therefore, the question is, why didn't the Syrian army act at all? Why was it so ineffective in a matter that I can't really explain? Like, even reach out ideas, or maybe they were on kind of drugs because of the Division 4 is constantly trafficking drugs to all across the Middle East. Maybe they used them themselves. Or there is another explanation that they were so neglected by Assad over the past few years that they've just betrayed him because salaries, because of other issues related to nurturing an army in a dictatorship, and he neglected it. Or maybe the fact that one of the major divisions was transferred from Aleppo area to Lebanon to fight Israel, and it was being really torn apart and destroyed. So the time needed in order to recover that would have been supplied by this Imam Hussein division, the time frame of creating enough time to the army to recover was limited. I don't know. Those are all options. The basic answer is the army didn't act, and all of them were in a huge surprise. So eventually, when they reconsidering their involvement, it was too late.
You describe, which is really a strategic defeat for Iran, given how everything has gone through there. You talk about the proxy network linking Qasem Soleimani, who was the mastermind of the Revolutionary Guards, and how they used it as a land bridge to Hezbollah. It might be hard for our listeners to understand, why do they hate each other? Is it because of a Sunni Shia thing? Is it a geopolitical thing? Do they see the rebels and Hezbollah because they were pro-Assad? I'm just wondering if Iran can recover. After all, Iran has a relationship with Hamas that is Sunni and they're Shia. I want people to understand, is this a glitch? It sounds like it's a strategic defeat, that Iran and Hezbollah are not going to be able to build relations with the new government in Syria because they were on the Assad side of the coin. Is that correct?
Well, in order to understand it, you must go back 10 years ago to the beginning of the civil unrest, the civil war in Syria, to understand how come Iran and Hezbollah achieved such a huge influence of Assad. Back then, 10 years ago, it started with a genuine revolution against the horrible regime of Assad by local defectors from the Syrian army, joined by local leaders. Back then, I had the privilege of working intensively with them because they asked for our help in the Golan Heights. I knew them for a close distance. They were genuine, seeking for a democracy with Assad. What happened later was the tragedy. They were overtaken by extreme jihadistic groups, mainly from Iraq, who penetrated the Jabhat al-Nusra. Eventually, it is HTS, entered from Iraq. Very little groups gathered momentum. They were well organized, well funded, partly from Qatar, partly maybe from Saudi, and they started joining those genuine rebels, later on becoming the dominant force that works against Assad regime. Later on came ISIS. And when ISIS came, joining them, all of the world, including United States, created the largest coalitions against ISIS. Also Iranian, there was a huge joint interest between US and Iran. Iran wanted to defeat ISIS, to defeat those Sunni Islamic jihadistic in order to save Assad, and the West, led by United States, wanted to defeat ISIS. Russia joined on. Also, ISIS were the worst of them all. Qasem Soleimani used the wave of him backed by the West in order to defeat ISIS, crush the rebels, and reaffirm Assad's regime with a huge help of the Russians. That's the way it stabilized for years. What happened right now is due to the fact that Iran is so weak, partly because of Israel striking on it without their response, which is considered to be huge humiliation for the Iranian. The fact that Hezbollah is degraded enormously and can't really help. The fact that Russia is preoccupied in the Kursk region, trying to get a foothold before winter comes, all of those three elements that created the supportive effect that diminished the power of those jihadistic Islamistic from the Nusra, once Nusra, right now HTS, were eliminated. That created the eruptions that we see right now. It's, yes, if you want to simplify it, it's a Shiite Sunni issue, but it's more complicated. It is basically the genuine urge for a change in Syria that was overtaken by Islamic jihadistic extremists that were counterattacked by the Shiite axis. And that's the complexity of the situation right now.
Just for our listeners, HTS is the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the Organization for the Liberation of the Mideast. They were democratic elements that were taken over by these jihadi forces and ISIS and al-Qaeda, but yet they have broken from them and have fought them too. And so people want to know, they're confused. Is this something that can be broadened out? Because they say now that they respect minorities and that they're not these extremists. But the question is, do you believe them? The fact that Israel has gone into this buffer zone in the Golan Heights on the Syrian side means that Israel's not so sure. People just want to know, do you think HTS could agree to broaden itself out to include non-Islamist components in a way to be a more inclusive Syrian government? Is it a hopeless case for Israel? How does Israel measure the threat of a new Syrian government?
Let's talk a little bit about HTS. HTS is an umbrella organization for several groups of rebels that worked against Assad. They were in the Idlib pocket, which is distant northern parts, where back in 2018, when Russia defeated the rebels, they have moved all of the rebels groups into the Idlib pocket. In Idlib pocket, there was a nurturing effect where HTS took under its wings large numbers of very small organizations. Back then, we called them Thousand Shades of Green, all under one constructive element. In Idlib, HTS built its power. HTS changed its name from Jabhat al-Nusra to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham because they wanted to distance themselves from ISIS. ISIS is the most extreme version of those elements. Al-Nusra is a little bit more moderate than ISIS. HTS wanted to deliver a message to the Western world and to the Syrian army that they are not part of ISIS. This is why they are rebranded themselves as that. In HTS, there are groups that are very Western-minded groups that really part of them wants a peace with Israel. I am being bombarded in 24 hours by groups of former rebels in the Golan Heights that used to be in touch with me, that they are now seeing opportunity of peace with Israel. And they see this a very positive development, and they are urging for us to return back to our past areas of influence. Why is Israel so worried? The question is, if it's that positive, it's HTS distance themselves from ISIS, consider it to be more moderate. And it's not just the one organization, it's the umbrella. Why are so worried? Because it's all a matter of how things will fall out and who will give the money. Basically, now they are taking over all of Syria. It is a destroyed country. Erdogan, who was the sponsor, who was backing HTS, who really gave the permission and the backing for the initial HTS assault on Aleppo, uses the new situation to get rid of about 2.5 million Syrian refugees that were in Turkey that were burdened on the Turkish economy. So here, right now, we can see a convoy of refugees returning back to Syria. Who will take care of them? It's a huge problem. I don't think Turkey will give the money. And I don't think HTS has the resources. Most of the money that Syria has is either from trafficking with drugs, and I don't think that they will continue this trafficking, or from oil. The oil is in the Quds area, northern to the Euphrates, under the control of a group called SDS.
Which is supported by the United States on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River.
Exactly, David. So either someone that is American, will try to reconnect Syria and say, okay, you have the money if you sell neft and the refineries, by the way, are on the west side. It's all very complicated. We have the oil, we have the refineries, we will help you sell. That will be a moderating effect. But if United States will distance themselves from HTS because they are former Nusra, former jihadistics, and they are not allowing them, they will ask for money. And I imagine if that's the case, you will see a re-entering of negative effect. ISIS will try to retake control over them. Malign activities from Russia that will try to support them and to regain control of Syria because they need the port in Tartus. So they will try to fill in the gap. If that's the case, we are facing a negative involvement where HTS will be overtaken by either ISIS or either extreme anti-Israeli groups and will probably create a different new set of threats.
President-elect Trump has said, well, the U.S. should stay away from this whole Syrian mess, as he would think of it. But do you believe that there needs to be an outreach effort? Maybe coming partly from the Turks that have been supportive of HTS when they were in that northwestern enclave of Syria and Turkey was over the border. Should it come from them? Should it come from the U.S., Europeans? Israel may be having what they did in your time, which was extending humanitarian assistance and medical help to the people in southern Syria, having also relations with the Druze, not to be confused with the Jews, but also has long-standing relations with the Kurds in eastern Syria. Is there a need for outreach to the HTS to test if it really is willing to break from its roots and is what it says it is, saying we're not part of them anymore, to try to bring them into a more moderate orbit? Or is it, are they going to exploit this and use it for jihadi purposes? This seems to be a real dilemma. Is it worth an outreach effort to test it, to see if they are who they say they are?
Definitely, and I'll explain why. It is crucial. It's not a privilege. We need to do that. Right now, there are three external major powers that are shaping Syria. Turkey is controlling, influencing HTS on all West Syria. United States is controlling the Kurds and the SPF in all of the eastern side of Syria. And Israel now is reconnecting to moderate rebels in the southern part of Syria, creating influence and destroying the Syrian army, as we started the discussion, and creating a buffer zone. Those three elements, Israel, Turkey, and United States, under the leadership of the United States, should joining to create international platform that will reach out and construct the outlines of a positive Syria that if HTS will follow it, we will support it and we will try to somehow help them get over of the catastrophe that calls itself Syria. I'm sure that Russia will do that. If the United States won't lead, Russia will lead. Russia will join in. Russia will ask them, will try to solve the problem. And Russians are excellent on exploiting situations that are vulnerable. All the parts are moving to get in and get influential. Just last point, very, very sensitive regarding the Druze. The Druze are half of them living in Israel and other half lives in Syria and Lebanon. Those Jews that are living in Syria consider HTS and all of jihadistics as problematic because the extreme jihad sections considers them as they call it takfiri, as Muslims that lost the way. That's very sensitive in Israel. Druze in Israel are worrying about their families along the border. And this is another thing that Israel and the international platform, which I suggested, needs to act in order to defend that. Otherwise, the Druze will take the law to their hands and really will go to fight to secure their communities.
So you're saying that Israel can help the Druze, D-R-U-Z-E, and keep relations with the Kurds, and at the same time try to do outreach to HTS to probe if they really are who they say they are, that they're not jihadis in a classic sense. And you think it's worth that effort for all these reasons, for an outreach effort to happen to test whether indeed moderate elements could emerge, and that Israel could have good neighborly relations with the new Syrian government?
Yes, there is, because in the Middle East, the friend of my enemy is not an enemy, and the enemy of my enemy is not my friend. It is more complicated. It's all about joint cause. They want Iran, Hezbollah, and all foreign entities that took over Syria to get out of Syria. They hate the Iranians. They consider them as a threat. They consider them as a malign intervening part, and Israel thinks that's so. And secondly, they want a genuine new Syria without the atrocities of the former Assad family that butchered them with gas, with horrible images that we are now seeing from prisons all across Syria that demonstrate how monstrous that Assad regime was. They want to replace the regime. Israel wants that also, and they want to tackle and prevent Iranians from intervening there. In those two goals, I think all Israel, Turkey, HTS, United States share the same goal. And this is an excellent point to start that kind of a platform of discussion.
On that hopeful note, I want to thank you very much for joining us today on Decision Points. Thank you very much, Tamir Hyman.
Thank you, David.
We just had a wide-ranging conversation with Andrew Tabler and Tamir Hyman about the profound historical moment we find ourselves in. The collapse of the Syrian army was astonishing. It signals not just the end of the Assad era, but also the potential to either trigger in an era of regional hope or instability. As we discuss, new dynamics are emerging, from the rising prominence of HTS to the enduring and potentially destabilizing toll of the Syrian refugee crisis. Meanwhile, the unraveling of the Shiite crescent in the Middle East, which is the weakening of Iran and the degradation of Hezbollah, provide the backdrop for these developments. While much remains uncertain, one thing is clear. The choices the U.S. and Israel make at this critical juncture could have far-reaching consequences for the region's future. Both Andrew and Tamir are wary of HTS, but do not want to shut the door on the possibility that the international community can be constructive in helping Syria if HTS moves to be more inclusive, to include non-Islamist elements. Both Andrew and Tamir believe neighbors of Syria, including Turkey and Israel, should extend humanitarian assistance because, first, it is the right thing to do, and it could also help key critical groups inside Syria that have an interest in a new and more open country and are willing to work together with the adjacent neighbors. One order has ended in Syria, and the other has yet to fully be born. The question is whether the new order could add to the region's stability or not. Many will be watching in the days and months ahead. Thanks to our listeners from around the world for joining us on another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Rena Gabbert, Simone Seidmayer, Sydney Hilbush, and Gabriel Epstein. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like yourselves for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can continue to grow this community. Subscribe to Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're on WhatsApp, X, or a variety of social media platforms, I invite you to share this show with your friends. To our listeners from all over the world, thank you for listening to this season of Decision Points.